Hi, I'm Robert Baptist with UiPath, and this is an overview of the Alpaca Form Builder. I created the Alpaca Form Builder project because attended automations in UiPath, something that's really unique to our platform, often need to contain user input that's more complex. In UiPath's 2018.3 release, there was a new activity called Custom Input that allowed you to display web input forms. The Alpaca UiPath Form Builder allows you to create responsive web-based user interfaces for your users to provide inputs in their attended automations without the need to know HTML or JavaScript. And the idea was to make this as easy as possible. So when you download the project, you get a library that you can include in your projects, which contains the functionality itself. You also get this template project, which contains several examples showing you how to use the libraries. In these subsequent videos, I'm going to be showing you some of these examples. I'm Robert Baptist with UiPath, and in this video I'm going to show how with the Alpaca Form Builder you can build a basic form and how to get started doing that using the method of dragging controls from the left side and the activities here over to your workflow. So to best illustrate this, I'm going to the template project that you get in the download, and I'm going to open an example here called Form Template. And this Form Template workflow gives you the most basic example in how to create a form. And you'll see that some of the activities that come from the Alpaca Form Builder are in use here. The first one is called Start Form. Start Form indicates that, as the name would suggest, that we want to start building a form. In this particular activity, you can affect things like your form title. So in this case, I might change the default form title of our form to "This is the form we are creating." And let's change the form title just for illustration purposes. You can also affect the submit button text and how the submit button looks. Most importantly, the start form activity outputs what's called a form payload. The form payload, the type isn't so important. It's a dictionary of strings and objects. But the form payload is what we're going to be passing around in our controls, and we'll show you that in a second. The other activity coming from Alpaca here in this workflow is called render form. Render form does what it suggests, which is render the form into an output file. So in this case, you can control the path where that gets written to. Then render form also indicates where the library should come from that Alpaca will use. For example, the Alpaca Form Builder uses jQuery, and by default, jQuery is being used from the internet. You could just as easily download jQuery and reference it locally, and here's where you would make those changes. The Alpaca Form Builder only uses libraries that it needs to, given the controls that you're using in a particular form. Also, things like what the footer HTML looks like, what the logo HTML looks like, that's all configurable here. What happens when the submit button's clicked? Usually you don't want to mess with that. And finally, the render form also takes that payload that I was talking about, that start form outputs. It actually takes an array of payloads because you can display multiple forms. I'll have more on that in a later video. Then finally, the last thing that this workflow is going to do is use the activity that was introduced in UiPath in the 2018.3 release called Custom Input to display the form that we just rendered. It's going to then deserialize the JSON from the user submission and then show that in a message box. And this is just for example. Of course, you would want to probably do something with that user submission, but showing it in a message box is good for this example. Let's now take a second to add a few controls to our form. So as I mentioned earlier, you can go to the Alpaca Form Builder library and we can do things like add a text field. Let's add some basics controls. So I'm going to drag a text field activity over here. And actually, I don't really need to change any properties, though there are a lot of choices here, except I must add that form payload that the start form activity output. Remember that form payload came from there. We're going to put that into this control here. And let's also add a drop down. So we take the select field and we drag it over. And again, we're going to give it that payload. That's the minimum that we need to do. In a second, I'll show you what happens when we change some more properties. I'm going to save this project, go ahead and run it. And when I run it, you'll see the form come up with the title that we gave it and a couple of controls. And we again told it what controls that we wanted to add, a text field and a drop down. And this is just the very basics. And if I'm an end user and I select some values here and I hit submit, those values come up in a message box here. So that's the most basic form, but what if we want to do more with our fields? Like you saw there was a strange label above the text field, and that was a default that got generated for us. What if we want to display a different caption above it? Well, for that, we would go to the text field and change its caption property. Let's change it to our text field. And there are a lot of options that you have here. These are in the documentation, one of them which is setting the default value on a field. Let's set that to our default value. One thing you might want to do is hide the field or make it read only. In this case, let's just make this text field required. You can control where field appears on the screen. I'll talk about that in a later video. Let's also change the minimum length of this field to be 4 characters. Let's also give this control a name. We'll call it control text. And I'll show you what that does when we run it in a minute. That's probably good enough for the text field. I need to make this a string, control text. Let's affect some things about the dropdown. For example, you might have noted that the values available in the dropdown were 1 and 2. Let's add to that. Let's make it 3 and 4. Any of these values, if you're familiar with UiPath, can come from other sources. I'm hard coding values here. This is just a string array. You can dynamically populate this dropdown from some other data in your workflow. Let's also make this a multi-select. So this was a single select dropdown that I showed in the first run. Let's now make it a multi-select dropdown. Let's also give this one a name and call it control select. Let's make it so that this one isn't sorted. Maybe we don't want to sort alphabetically, or you can also give it a function here and your own sort function. I'm going to save this workflow and run it again. And it does what you would expect, I think, in that now we have a caption up here. I didn't actually change the caption for this one. It used its name. But here we have a caption, our text field. We have a default value here. If I delete that default value and tab out, you can see the field is now required. That's one thing that we said. And also it must have at least 4 characters. That's another thing that we specified. So if I give it 2 characters and tab out, it's still going to complain that we need to have 4 characters and I can't submit the forms. Let's give this 4 characters. And then our drop down, we added the additional field. Now the user can select one or many items out of that. So there's an example of that. And when I hit submit now, you can see the names are in effect. They're more nicely named, and I can grab these values out explicitly from the JSON that comes back here. And you can see that the user's submission comes back in the message box. That's the general idea with this method of building forms with Alpaca. And there are a few other methods I'll show in later videos. You take controls from the left side. There are activities here, drag them over into your workflow, use start form and render form to control how the form is rendered, and you get to control which controls appear and in what order and what they do. One more thing of note with the output of the Alpaca form builder, if we go out to the file system and look at the HTML that was just generated in the example we just did, I can open this in a browser and it's going to work happily outside of UiPath. I can also render and execute it on my favorite web server. It's going to work. In other words, Alpaca form builder becomes a generic form builder. The resulting output is completely usable outside of UiPath. I'm Robert Baptist with UiPath, and in this video, we're going to look at the controls that are available to you with the Alpaca Form Builder. If we go to the library itself, any activity that's prefixed with lowercase ctrl stands for control. Those are all available for you to use as web form controls. And if you go to the template project that is available in the download and open a file called Multiform Controls Showcase, it will show you the controls that are available to you, or at least examples of the use of those controls. Before I run and show you these and describe the controls, I do want to make the point that you can have multiple forms on a single page, and this workflow is actually an example of that. There are multiple start form activities in this particular workflow. Then at the end in render form, this is why render form takes an array of payloads. Here you can see. So we're passing it multiple form payloads, and that's what's going to enable us to show multiple forms on a single page. So that's a sidebar there. Going back to the controls that are available themselves, just with text fields alone, we're coming in here and you can see there are date controls, date time controls, numbers, currency, and selectors, or what we consider to be drop downs, radio button sets, checkbox sets, etc. Let's go ahead and run this. I think the visual is better than trying to describe it verbally. And now this has come up. We can see that for the multiple forms on the page, that those are represented up here as these tabs. So the first form that we built, called text field examples, these show different kinds of text fields. I also showed an example of validation on a text field, like for example, a field being required or having a minimum length. There are date picker controls where you can choose just a date and you have complete control over the format of the date. This is a US centric date format here. You can control, for example, whether manual entry is allowed into a date field or not. There's a date time picker that allows you not only to choose the date, also the time in the control, and that format is completely configurable as well. A currency field where I can't type in Any non-numeric characters and the currency sign and decimal character are completely configurable. In any of these controls, default values are always available to be set. So that's a really important part of providing user input within the context of an attended process is filling in default values. There's a text area, a number field, and then all sorts of validation fields, like a field that will require an email address, a password field, a zip code validating field, a URL validating field, a phone number validating field. Again, all these formats are configurable, 5-digit or 9-digit zip, and finally a file selector field. More interesting, I think, are selector examples. So this includes drop downs, where again, all the elements in the drop down in any of these lists are completely configurable. Multi-select drop-downs where I can allow the user to select multiple items, a country drop-down where countries are displayed by default, a North American-centric state drop-down. This is configurable also as to whether to include territories or not, a chooser where you can have a user choose one or more items using this kind of GUI where they can resort or find elements, that kind of thing. Of course, your run-of-the-mill radio buttons where selections are mutually exclusive and checkboxes where the user can choose one or more items. There are rich text editors that you can add where you have a few different choices of that, where users can enter using Microsoft Word or other word processor type of interface to enter and edit rich text. Color picker examples, there's a few examples of color pickers where users can choose colors and you can control the format of how those come back. And then I think for more advanced situations, what we call array examples, where users can add one or more sets of items. And those sets of items, what you get in a set is completely configurable. And whether these are drop downs or entry fields is all configurable. But it's a way for a user almost to edit like a spreadsheet or a grid. You can have it in this kind of tabular format or have this concept in more of a groups of field kind of format here, where again, what the fields are, how they're labeled, how many there are per set, that's all configurable. I'm Robert Baptist with UiPath, and in this video I'm going to talk about how the Alpaca Form Builder supports different types of form layouts. If you look in the Form Builder template project that comes with the download and open a XAML file called Multi-Form Different Layouts, you'll see an example of 4 different forms, each with different numbers of column layouts. So there's a single column layout form, one with 2 columns, 3 columns, and then 4 columns. How is this done? If you look at the start form activities for each of these forms, and we're going to look at the 1 column layout here, there's a property called Layout Template. And in this property, you control what a row looks like for the form that you're building. And you can go ahead and just stick with the defaults in these examples. If you want a 1-column form, use this. If you want a 4-column form, you would use this particular piece of text. Really what it's doing is it's dividing the columns up into proportions of 12 using the style sheet classes. If any of you are familiar with Bootstrap, that's the basis on which this framework is built on Bootstrap. So these style sheet classes should add up to 12. So in the 4-column example, we have 3 times 4 of these columns. And then you'll notice that each of these columns have IDs, column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4 in the 4-column example. In the single column example, you'll only see a single ID in here. Again, this adds up to 12. The double or dual column example you would imagine has 6 and 6, each with 2 columns. Now, where are these IDs used? If you look at any of the controls that get rendered, they are going to be used, as this is a text field here, in the layout binding property. Normally, when you're working with a control on a form, you would probably just hard code this, put column 1 or column 2, depending on which column you wanted to put it. I'm generating these 4 forms dynamically, so I'm actually putting that value in a variable. And I'm doing a little calculation here, and you'll see why maybe in a minute when I run it. It uses the mod operator to determine which column it will divvy the particular field into. But you can see all of these start with column hyphen and then a number, and that's going to place it where it needs to be. So if we run this multi-form different layout example, you'll see that in the single column example, those 20 fields get generated dynamically. It was done in a loop, and they're all put into a single column. 2-column example, each of the 20 fields put into 2, 3-column example into 3 columns, and 4-column example evenly distributed into 4 columns. Looking at the workflow, again, that's controlled at the control level with the layout binding property, where this layout binding string is set to an ID that gets set up when you look at the start form in the layout template property. Each of these should have IDs. Again, if you just stick with the defaults and how this works, you should be good. I'm Robert Baptist with UiPath, and in this video I'm taking a look at the Alpaca Form Builder and how you can generate forms dynamically in your workflows. In this case, we're looking at the template project that comes with the download, looking again at the multi-form different layouts file that you'll find in there. The interesting thing about these forms that are being generated is that they're generated on the fly. You can, of course, drag activities for the controls that you want to build on a form all very explicitly out into your workflow. This, however, is an example where text fields are being generated in a loop. In general, all of the data that you can build on an Alpaca form can be generated dynamically, and that could include, for example, what is selectable in a dropdown or what is choosable from a radio button set. Those radio buttons themselves can be generated dynamically. In this case, the controls are also being generated dynamically. So quite arbitrarily in this example, we have a do while loop that's being cut off at 20 elements. And for each of these forms, therefore, with the different layouts, it's generating 20 controls per form. So if we run this, even though we only have a few activities in our workflow that actually show a text field being generated, in fact, one for each of these forms, we have 80 controls being generated for this particular page because it's being done in a loop. And in that way, you can build forms that are dynamic based on data that you're getting in other part of your workflow. So you might have a web service call, for example, earlier in this workflow that's controlling what a user should be able to input in an attended process. In fact, the number of inputs, what they're labeled, etc. So that is really the power of dynamic form building, where you don't know what your form is going to look like at design time, but at runtime of your workflow, when the data is coming in dynamically, you can generate your form to your liking. I'm Robert Baptist with UiPath, and in this video we're looking at the Alpaca Form Builder and an example of how you can create a more simplified form builder or form designer using Excel with one of the examples that I provided. Now, if you look in the Form Builder template project that comes in the download, there's a file I have open here called Build Form from Excel. Download also comes with a sample Excel file that a user can use to build a form themselves without having to worry about many of the properties that you'll see with the start form, the render form, with the controls themselves. So the idea is, in this case, the user can set their form title here in this row of the Excel spreadsheet. They can set things like their submit button text, how many columns are in the form, so they don't have to worry about any of those properties. Do they want to display the title text? What file name do they want the output rendered to? Then in this part of the spreadsheet, they indicate what controls they want on their form. So there's actually a drop down on the Excel spreadsheet for this particular column A here, where they can choose what kind of control. Then the order in which they are presented here in the spreadsheet are the order in which they will be rendered on the screen. So let's go ahead and run this example, this build from Excel example. It's going to look a little bit messy maybe, or a little bit just like a cornucopia of fields, but that was the idea, is that I put in this spreadsheet every type of field, and I really limited the number of properties that you could set. I did put validation for whether the fields are required or not, what their caption above them is, what their default value is, and in the case of drop downs, radio buttons, checkboxes, things like that, like what their choices are. Beyond that, I didn't include any other properties. So if you look at what results, it's just essentially a bunch of fields that are appearing that I've specified in my spreadsheet. But I think you understand the power of this. You can put the form design in the Alpaca Form Builder actually in Excel here. And I've given an example where I've taken many of the properties of the controls out so that a novice user can build a form with an Excel spreadsheet, and you can actually email spreadsheets around and have those represent forms that you or your colleagues have built. So it's using Excel as a designer for the Alpaca Form Builder. I'm Robert Baptist with UiPath, and right now I'm using the Alpaca Form Builder to show that it's possible to build a form using a visual editor. And so I've opened the template project you can see here where my mouse is, and I've opened a XAML file called build form visually, and I've gone ahead and run that XAML file. And when you do that, it pops up an HTML form here that allows you to design a form. So in the output of this, and you'll see in a second, will be an HTML file that you can then use in your workflows. So the designer itself shows a designer tab here, a preview tab here, and then here you can save if you're done. And it starts off with a few fields by default. I can delete this password field as an example and then drag a new single line text field. You can see it's a drag and drop interface. I can drag that under here and there's a caption above it that says new text. I can click on the property pages, change the label. You can see there's many more properties to be edited here. And let's move over here and click on the Save tab. At the end, I would hit Save when I'm done designing my form. And as I said, it's going to render that form into HTML. Here I've put the form designing and the form displaying all in the same workflow for simplicity. I put up a message box that says, all right, the form has been built. Let's display it using the UiPath custom input activity. So we do that, and it's going to display the form that we just created. So in that way, you can use a visual editor to build forms within the Alpaca Form Builder. Thank you. Hi, I'm Robert with UiPath, and this video is concerning how, when you use the Alpaca Form Builder, you can take the data out of the user's form submission and use it. In this example, again, I've got the Alpaca UiPath Form Builder template project open. This is included in the download when you download the library. And this time I've got a file open called mail-to-example.xaml. And in this one, it's a very simple form. It's a form with a text field and a text area in it. The main reason I wanted to include this mail-to-example is in parsing the data out. So I show two ways that you can do that. The first thing you want to do after the custom input, getting the result back, it comes back as a JSON string. You want to deserialize that JSON string into an object. So we use deserialize JSON, and then checking for nulls and nothings. If we have some output back, then I show an example of, number one, iterating through all of the name value pairs that come back in a generic way. So this is very powerful if you want to construct an email of everything that got submitted in the form. And that's exactly what I'm doing here in this loop. And another example where I show explicitly how you can grab a specific value out of the JSON. In the subject line of the email, I actually take the value from the first text field in the user submission out explicitly. Two methods shown here, the loop, iterating through it all generically, and then the second way, getting a specific value out. This is a good sample for showing how to get data out of the user's form submission.